Okay. So conceptually, what they hit you with was stuff that we covered last week, but sometimes it's difficult to get it in the right context because of how it's worded. It's one of those things that when you've had to go through it on a day-to-day basis, that it starts to really make a lot of sense why things are happening a certain way. I think one of the things I said last week was we're taking efforts to be more secure, and all too often the efforts that we take to secure a system end up swinging around and biting us because people react to those processes in ways or I should say in ways that override them in any way they can. So if you're making them change their password too frequently and they're having problems remembering it, they're going to start writing it down. If you're making the passwords too complex, they're going to start writing them down. And then we end up with breaches. I don't know if you guys have been getting hit with it in the last, I'd say 2-3 weeks. Phishing left and right, both at FAU and Palm Beach State, almost on a daily basis. And I don't know what's triggering it, but it's happening, and they're not catching it usually until somebody takes the bait. Here. There's
I mean,
things that
I've
we
been seeing people sending me invoices as well. Like, hey, I have your invoice for this or that, or could you change your password for this account?
Oh, I get it all the time. Banks that I don't do business with, oh, we need, yeah, no, you don't. The ones that have caught me off guard, not that I fell for it, but I had to look at them 2 or 3 times because they really did their work, making it appear legit. Where they had hacked somebody's account in one instance, they had hacked somebody's account at FAU and had it coming from an FAU email address, or they had spoofed an FAU email address. In either event, they had it laid out like, here's the scholarship information that you need for the upcoming semester, and you need to fill this out. And everything about it looked legit until they said, please respond using a Gmail account and not your university ID. And next thing I know, we're getting hit with a similar thing at Palm Beach State. So at a glance, they just look so legit, but there's always something that is a giveaway that's the tell that lets you know, hey, this is shady because they don't want you following normal protocols. The stuff that we got to deal with today, jump beyond some of the stuff that we did last week. Some of the stuff will be a rehash, but some of it will not. So we talked about ways to go about securing your systems, and securing your system is going to be not significantly different than anything you've already had to deal with in an organization. They want all their stuff secure, so it's the same kind of processes, but now the onus is on you to implement whatever the strategy is going to be. You determine how you're going to secure your system. Now, I just had a discussion, it was a Tuesday's class, a hardware software class, about why do we talk about older equipment? Why do you need to be familiar with older equipment? Well, it's the older equipment that you see breaking more than the new equipment. So if you're repairing computers, you need to be familiar with stuff that's 5, 7, 10, 12 years old. And it's not unheard of to see stuff that's 30, 40 years old. So with that said, we talked already about BIOS and UEFI and the difference between the two. Now, in older machines, we can put a password, an administrative password, on the BIOS. Now, if we think back to how the BIOS works, where does that information live or where does it exist? It's on a chipset on the motherboard. And it's considered ROM or read-only memory, but we can overwrite it, we can flash it, or we can get access to modify it, depending on the situation. But the administrator's password and user passwords, the user passwords are on the OS, but the administrator's password is on, ultimately, if you put it on the BIOS, it's written into the BIOS. Now, let's say that, oh, God forbid, I got a coworker just reached out to me today that a relative passed away due to a horrible, horrible accident. And they need to access the computer and the phones and everything to be able to get to accounts to take care of things and let people know what's taking place. And if you don't have a password to an Apple device, you're going to have a difficult time getting into it unless there's some alternate mechanism that's been created as a backup to get in. The older systems, the ones that had the administrator's password on the BIOS, if you didn't have the administrator's password, you're not getting in through software. The way you're getting in is there's what's called a jumper. It almost looks like a really small piece of Lego, like the little 2-circle Lego one. Really, really small. And there's 2 wires that are on the motherboard itself, and the jumper connects those 2. Now, the password's enabled if the jumper's in place. The password's disabled if the jumper's not in place. So if you set an administrator's password on an older device and you're the administrator, nobody's getting into that without your password, unless they open it up and pull the jumper. Now, they try to do away with these jumpers whenever they can, cut down on any little pieces and parts that if they don't need them, they don't want to put them in there. Now, if we're thinking now about how do we deal with UEFI and where does UEFI live? Well, UEFI is on the hard drive. And if we put an administrator's password in that area, it's not on the board, it's not in ROM. It's going to be in a location on the hard drive. You'll have an interface that you can get to it, and it won't be the same kind of jumping through hoops that it would be for an older system with the jumper now. Last week, we talked about what it was to be a strong password think we talked about what a hash was. One of the things that came about, thinking about how long ago it was now, it just makes me feel old. Back when Windows 95 existed, securing a computer was all about securing the individual computer, because the internet was very young at that point. We weren't networking computers the way we are now. We didn't have Wi-Fi. And as those things evolved, we had to come up with an operating system that integrated this server style of controlling access. So up to that point, access was controlled on the individual device itself. You didn't have access controls outside the device or over a network. Microsoft came up with their new technology file system and Windows NT. And that NTFS stands for New Technology File System. Along with Windows NT, their networking server-side software, they came up with this concept of Active Directory. Now, conceptually, it's something we've dealt with for forever. If you think back, well, I don't want to talk about thinking back. Let's just look at how we deal with things, let's say on our phones. On your phone, if you want to get a hold of somebody, you've got a couple of options. One, you look on your contact list on your phone. And if you don't have the contact information for that individual on your phone where you've saved it, then you got to go find it somewhere else. And there are places you can go find the information. So if you didn't have somebody's phone number in the not too distant past, you could have called 411 and there would have been somebody to tell you what the phone number was if it was a listed or public number. Now, we have specific servers that have taken on these roles now. So things that we had people doing in the past, now we've got devices and software that does it. So Active Directory keeps track of the resources themselves and the people. And people, you know, by the words human resources, we are considered as a resource, and depending on the organization, we can have a great deal of value associated with us or very little. So with that said, Active Directory will keep track of information about the individuals. So if you're going to get access to a system, we can use Active Directory as a mechanism to store all your access permissions. Now that's on networked devices. And essentially Microsoft, well, as everybody else, they want everything that you're doing to be networked. They want you on a networked device. They don't want you on a standalone. They want to keep you engaged. It's a business thing. They want you on a subscription to anything they can so they can constantly be generating revenue. So if you're connected to them in some way, they can consistently be accessing you and trying to bring you back in, sell you more stuff or whatever it may be. So the more connected you are, the more they're maintaining that relationship. I'm not looking at it as a conspiracy kind of thing. It's just a reality of it. So over a network, we'll use Active Directory. But if we don't have a network, we've got to take care of this stuff on our computer. And on the computer itself, I can go in and set up permissions, user permissions, allow specific users, set up their passwords where they can access my device. Now, that's if the device is not networked. Once I connect it to a network, it changes things, at least with Win 10 and Win 11 now. It changes things. So let's assume that I got this computer and it's not networked. Or it has network capabilities, but I'm not connected to it. And I set up user accounts for everybody in the family. And you forget your user account. You forget your password. And the only way that it'll let you back in at this point is if you have the recovery disk, the disk that we talked about before that we used to do the install. Well, we'll let you in if you have that. And it has to be the right build number. It has to be the right software. If it's not, we're not going to let you in. But if you're connected to a network, we'll let you log in and we'll help you log in using your Microsoft credentials, your Microsoft account credentials. And if they verify who you are via Microsoft, they will then help you with the software on that device. So essentially, it would let you log in through the network. The problem is, if you can't log in and you're not connected to the network, connecting to the network's more than just plugging a wire in. So if nobody has configured the network settings and you just plug it in, you're not going to get anywhere with it. But if it's all been set up and they just left it unplugged to keep you offline, and plugging it in enables that connection without any having to do anything with login credentials, it would then allow you to, like I said, through Microsoft's credentials, to get through things. We talked about what a strong password was last week. Remember what the best thing you can do to make your password more secure? Which is more secure? A password that is 25 characters long, or a password that's 7 characters long, and it involves uppercase, lowercase, numbers, and 3 special characters, like ampersand and @ %, those kind of things. Which one's more secure?
Pretty sure the longer the password, the better.
That's it. That's it. So
yeah,
the longer we go, the better that we are. And essentially the best way to look at it, it's all straight math. It's really all it is. It's just math. You've got a number of options for each position in the password. So let's say that we had 10 different options. And this is like figuring out the odds for the lottery. Let's say you had 10 different options that you could pick from for the first character in your password. and it was only one long. Well, that means you've got 100, you've got 10 different options that it could be. If you had two characters, two positions, 10 characters, 10 options for each one of them, the same 10. Now you've kicked it up to 100. And you're going up exponentially as you go. And so we're 10 times 10. The third position times 10. Now we're up to 1,000 different combinations, and it keeps going. So if I've got 7 to 10 positions, it's the number of options to that exponent. As we take this thing longer, this thing's growing exponentially with each additional character. Not each additional character or option at the position, but how long it gets. The longer it gets, the tougher it gets for these systems to break whatever that code is. Today, it's not a problem with the processor being able to just brute force get through that. Now it's how do you have that back and forth with the system long enough to get away with it? How do you have that many attempts before the system says, wait a minute, something shady going on? That's why we lock it down to where, look, you got 5 attempts, and then you're going to have to wait a while. Because 5 attempts is not long enough to get through it. That's one great mechanism to throwing these things off. And now we've got what you've been dealing with now for years to where it's, okay, CAPTCHA, gotta love this. Which ones have street signs in them? Which ones have horses and which ones have boats? And with AI, there's software that can tell you which ones have boats or goats or trains or signs. So the capacity of computing's catching up with all of these mechanisms that we're putting in place to secure things. So now we've gone to the point that, all right, we're not just going to rely on one type of authentication. Now we got to go to 2 factors, 2 different types of authentication. And it could end up being biometric along with it, whether it's your fingerprints, facial recognition, your iris, looking at your eye. The problem with that, though, is I love going fishing, and I've got biometric access on my phone. And when your fingers are wet, your fingerprint changes. The tissue becomes so hydrated that it's not the same fingerprint per se, or it's not being read exactly the same. The system's not that good. So biometrics, yeah, it's recognizing you, but if you're putting a thumbprint that is slightly altered, it's going to say, yeah, no, that security is going to work, and it's going to say you're not you. So there's issues with it that they're having to come up with, but it's happening. They're finding ways to make it more secure. So all of these options we have available to us, depending on the OS, whether it's a picture, a password, a security key, Windows Hello, they came up with that as a way to deal with it. Windows Hello fingerprint. It recognized your face. And a lot of this came from phones more than the traditional desktop or laptop computer. But it works. Wow. So comment in the post or in the chat that banks want pins. And pins are traditionally 4 to 6 digits long. And they know, they're totally aware that pins are easy to crack. They do have in place a strict rule of how many times you can attempt it before you get locked out. And they're going to make you wait before you can try again. Or you might have to call in and actually talk to somebody. They're trying their best to make things easy. But at the same time, it's thinking about the banking industry. There's things that they do, and I'm not bashing the banking industry. There's things they do that I've got a lot of problems with. They're a business, first and foremost. They're there to make money. By loaning money out or in any other way they can make money. And like insurance agencies, which they work very similar. Insurance and banking, they really go hand in hand. They look at risk associated with investments. And the security systems themselves are investments. Your individual personal security, not a big deal to them. Security to prevent people from getting to their systems, their controls to where they handle their money, that's absolutely different. They'll spend money and make it more difficult on that side. But when it comes to clients or customers accessing it, they're insured. And they look at the insurance as cause for them to not want to spend money or time on those things. I remember had a credit card that I just gotten. It was years ago, but it was the first time that I went to use this card. I called up a pizza place. It was like 3 streets away from me and ordered pizza. Went over, picked it up. I thought everything's great. First time I'd ever used a card. And that was about 6:30, 7 o'clock at night. By 11 o'clock at night, that card was maxed out. And I get an alert the next day because I didn't know what had happened. And I dig into it, and clearly the only place that card was used was the pizza place. And I went to the pizza place and the manager said, we don't have a problem here. It appears you've got a problem with your card, but I don't have a problem here because I told my people here, don't write down the credit card information because we don't want that happening anymore. And in a nutshell, it was a known problem where employees were writing down the credit card numbers when you gave them to them to be processed to pay for the pizza. And then in my instance, they went on StubHub or something like that and bought tickets to this, tickets to that, bought whatever they could with it. When I talked to the police department about it, they said, so what'd your bank do? That's what the bank said, don't worry about it, because they didn't have the security information they needed, and they weren't going to hold me accountable for it. So they said, I'm not a victim. The bank is now the victim, and the bank's not going to do anything about it. And the guy said, I remember a case a few months prior where there was a $150,000 mortgage fraud case. They had somebody, they wanted to arrest him, and the bank said, you know what? don't worry about it. We're not going to press charges because it's going to cost them more in attorney's fees and everything else. We'll just write it off. They had no problem with writing off the $150,000. And those 4-digit PIN numbers are traditionally access to accounts with far, far less than that. So it's not a priority for them. It's really not. They write it off, and it's, in a sense, cost of doing business. But we've got to prioritize what's important when it comes to the system itself. What information's important, and where do we need to focus our security? They keep things sectioned off, if you will, to where that system that you're getting into with the 4-digit PIN is isolated in many respects from the important stuff. Now, it's important to me what I see that I'm accessing when I'm getting into my bank account and everything else, but to them, that's not such a big deal. They've got the important things locked down, and it's different access to get to them. We create policies, whether it's individual policies, local policies, as a group, or I can have policies for specific machines. And once you become a member of a group, or you are provided access to a specific system, it becomes part of your profile within that system. Now, it can be cumbersome to manage. And I've got an entire course to teach on network administration, dealing with Active Directory. And that's, like I said, Active Directory is dealing with those resources. Who has access to them? What are we naming them? How are we organizing them? How are we controlling them? Are we making sure that we've got the redundancy that we need? And we do it with policies. So here's the policy. If you're a member of this group, you have access to these folders. You can access the system between these hours. Just like if you were manager of, say, a store, there's policies associated with being a manager. It's not necessarily going to be the same policies that somebody else that works for the same company is going to have to adhere to. So the policies themselves, we want them to be as strict as possible. Because once somebody's in, or somebody's had access to something, makes it difficult to undo what's been done. I'd rather somebody not have access and not break something than accidentally have access and something bad happens that could cost the organization millions of dollars. And sadly, it's reality that these incidents can cost organizations millions of dollars. So we set up groups so that you can be the member of a group. I can't remember, I think I mentioned it before. Let's say that you were a member of the payroll department. So we'll make you a member of the payroll group. Now, I've also got an accounting group. And the accounting group by default, they have access to everything payroll has access to. And they have access to even more things that the payroll group doesn't have access to. Because accounting has access to payrolls. It's got access to all the different departments and all their budgets, all the accounts. So members of other groups could have access to small pieces of what the accounting group has access to, but not all of it. There's things that payroll may not need to have access to. They don't need to know how much was spent for equipment. Not their job, not their business. So we can set those permissions associated with a job role or a department that you were in. So it could be permissions associated with your job role, could be the department as a whole, or you could have a combination thereof. You've got permissions that come with your job role. You've got permissions that are associated with the department that you're in. You could have permissions associated with the division of the organization that you're in. Oh, you work in the Eastern Division. You don't have access to the Central Division stuff. Well, it's all the same company. No, we keep them separated. But that doesn't mean that nobody has access to all three divisions, Eastern, Central, and Western. There are going to be groups that have access to those things. So the more we can isolate individuals and limit their access, the more secure we can make these things. So we've got to set up as many different groups and policies as need. And the unfortunate part is the more that we set up, the more we're going to have to control. But once we've got them set up, well, I could just make you a member of that group. And by being a member of that group, you inherited all the permissions associated with it. So once it's configured, the rest of it comes pretty easy as far as making somebody a member of a group or saying, you know what, we're going to have to let you go quick and that fast, you don't have access to anything. Because we can go in and say, all right, now you are no longer a member of these groups, or we're denying you all your permissions. Got one of the labs in Lake Worth that we have as, excuse me, it's called an isolated subnet. Now, a subnet essentially is an organized group of computers with associated IP addresses. See if I got a good example that kind of put it into context. My phone number starts with 239. And sometimes people, when they see my phone number, they're like, wait, do you live in Fort Myers? I don't now, but I did for years. And that first three numbers in the phone number, that prefix, is associated with a geographic region. That's Southwest Florida. And all the numbers that start with 239 are in this, say, a logical group, if you will. Now that's a subgroup. We've also got a country code that goes in front of that. And depending on the country code, that'll dictate whether you are in the US, a country down south in South America, Central America, or if you're Europe, Asia, wherever it is, there's a country code, 2 digits, that goes up in front of our traditional 7-digit numbers. Now, it's a logical grouping. And essentially, when we log our computers onto a network, we've got to have the equivalent of a phone number. It's an IP address. And it's set up in 3 sections. And kind of like your social security number in a way. And they're divided by a period, or you say a dot. So 192.168.001. There's potential IP address. And that IP address can be grouped together, but when we group it together, there's another number that's the subnet mask. And that dictates that we're all grouped together. Now, that isolated subnet, and I gotta love it. When you go to log in, you're not logging into the subnet for the rest of the college. The rest of the college is on subnet that uses Active Directory and your student account, your student information, to allow you to log in. My subnet, the isolated subnet, doesn't have access to any of that. They don't want me to have any way to come close to it. Bad things had happened at one point where students got inquisitive and wanted to see if they could actually do something, and they were successful. And what they were trying to do compromised different resources to where the college said, wait a minute, we're not going to, this is not going to happen again. And it wasn't about necessarily the access to the computer or to the network. It was the computers that we were able to use to access the network and the connections that we had. So they said, you know what? You're not going to have access to it. And you go ahead and set your own permissions up, set your own accounts up. And you're going to have to log in on your own little domain. So we'll create our own little domain on all those computers in that one lab. Who's going to manage it? The faculty teaching in that classroom, and I guess I'm the only one over the summer teaching in there. So if you want to access one of those computers, I manually have to go set up an account for you. They're going to create the account. Then we'll create student groups. The students will have access to certain folders and resources. And then all of this has to be built out and managed. And then what happens when somebody forgets their password? You got to go log into Active Directory and configure the accounts. Go ahead and reset the account and say, here you go, here's a temporary password to get in. I require you to create a new password once you get in. And that password is only going to be good for a specific period of time. And I think now it's set at somewhere between 90 or 120 days. That ever so often you've got to go through it. All right, time for a new password. Like I said, that's just another reason to go through and have to write it down. So the different accounts that we've got, I can create multiple levels of management But ultimately, the highest level is administrator. And I can have as many administrators as I want. And it's good to have more than one administrator in case something happens to the one administrator. Like I said, if something did happen to the administrator and the system was on a network connected to the internet, we could use Microsoft credentials to get around it. But it's good to have at least 2 administrators when we've got the ability to. They advise you to rename the administrator account from admin to something else. Anything to change things from whatever the default was can help prohibit somebody from hacking into the system. So if they know what things are by default named, or sadly, if I log on, say I'm trying to log on to a Wi-Fi access point, all too often you can recognize the type of access point it is by its name, if it has not been renamed. So if it says D-Link model whatever, okay, let me go online and see what's the default admin password for that D-Link access point. If they didn't change the name of the access point, then clearly they didn't change the name from the username from admin to something else. So it's going to be admin. And if I throw in that default password, now I've got access. So as much as we can change the name of things, it's just one more hurdle for somebody to have to get around. We can put time restrictions and noted that you can force people to leave at a certain point in time to where their access cannot go past a specific time frame, or you cannot log in after a certain time. When it comes to Microsoft, it's a single sign-on. So what you use to log into the system, if the account has been registered with Microsoft, everything's synced up. They know all of it. It's all in OneDrive. They've got all of it. By logging into the operating system, you've acknowledged to Microsoft and the operating system who you are. And once it's all connected on the front end, initially, everything back in the background, if you will, stays connected as soon as you log in. I talked before about disabling auto run and autoplay because of USB devices. We talked about it last week. A lot of organizations will not allow you to bring USB or thumb drives on their property anymore because bad things can happen. Sadly, you can conceal a thumb drive that's just about anything you could think of because they become so small. Now, these files and folders that they're talking about on this one page, if we think about how these files and folders are made up, we talked about it before, they're all ones and zeros on the hard drive. So it's just a bunch of ones and zeros, switches that are either on or off. And if somebody knew the mapping of all those ones and zeros, they've got all my data. But we're not passing the ones and zeros, reading things as we pass them. We've got to have some kind of go-between to secure them. And essentially what we can do is encrypt what's there. Now, these combinations of ones and zeros, there's a lot of what's called mapping going on. Kind of like think of it as the scavenger hunt in a way. As long as you have all the clues and somebody went and hid pieces at specific locations, you can find everything you need to assemble whatever it may be. Now, if this map that you're given for the scavenger hunt had it encrypted, it was written in a way that you had to have a key to decode each step of the directions. That makes it a whole lot more difficult to assemble all the pieces, as opposed to everything's in clear text, step by step, how you go about doing everything. So what we've been able to do with Windows, and this is the biggest things that they've pushed for years, is being able to encrypt files, folders, data across the wire, have a key that you have to use or possess to unlock or read whatever the data may be. I remember I took a class at one point that, I guess in a way, it was a novel idea that the professor had, what he was requiring us to do, but it was such a pain. We literally, every student in the class had to go create an account with a third-party encryption provider. So there's software available that you create an account and you have your own personal key, and the other person has their key. And based on their key and your key, the company will create this special key for them to be able to open up whatever the device is, whatever it may be. And it could be an email, message, could be a file, could be anything. So it's a combination of the two individual keys have to be possessed to be able to open up the message. Every piece of homework, every assignment had to be submitted using this high-level security. Absolute pain. And I get it. I totally get it. I don't work in an environment that requires that level of security. But at that point in time, I was being trained to manage those kinds of systems. And they wanted me to get used to using that type of security. The more comfortable you are using it, the easier it is to get other people on board to use it as well. Without the keys, nobody's getting in. And it's almost like you've all seen on TV, if you haven't seen an actual safe deposit box, where it's a box in a wall in a bank, takes two keys to open it. And if both keys are not available, you're not getting in. Same concept. The encryption, and this goes back to the password concept. The keys create a hash. The combination of keys create a hash. And having just one key makes it real difficult to generate a hash, come up with what the hash is. The longer the encryption, the more bits associated with the encryption, the more difficult it is to break the encryption. So it kind of goes back to how long your password is. The longer the password, the harder it is to break. The more complex the level of encryption, the harder it is for a system to get past it. Sadly, if you lose your key, now think about that relative to the safety deposit box concept. Anybody loses their key, yeah, you got problems. Now, it doesn't mean there's not a workaround, but workarounds are not necessarily easy, and they're difficult for a reason. If you forget your password, all right, you're going to have to call us. And then we're going to ask you a bunch of questions before we just give you a way to get in. And once you've confirmed who you are, all right, I'll go ahead and give you a way to get in. And you can go reset your password. Now, I don't know if any of y'all have dealt with it, but when they send you emails all the time to, all right, it's time you're going to have to renew your password or change your password. You've got 45 days, 44 days, 43 days. Every time you turn around, you're getting another email. 29 more days till you. I just don't want to deal with it. Now I'm happy with the password I got. Come on. And at a certain point, I just start ignoring it. I don't want to deal with it now. And then what happens when you pass that day? There's not a mechanism for you to get in. You've actually got to call somebody now. And if it's a Saturday or Sunday, odds are you're not going to be able to. So there's all these hurdles in place to try and keep people from accessing or getting past different things. So we've got a mechanism to secure the hard drive itself at the smallest level. Call it BitLocker. It's a way to encrypt the drive itself. And like I said, you've got to have a key to access that encryption through this software. Now, it's a common software, and it locks the hard drive, and it's the entire volume of the hard drive. So it could be your entire Windows volume. It could be more than just that. You can lock down as much as we want, but you're going to have that key. You got to make sure that you don't lose the key, because sometimes these things are not as easy to get around. They've got something called, excuse me, a TPM chip, Trusted Platform Module chip. And it's on the motherboard. And that holds the information or the algorithm, if you will, to enable BitLocker. It's got part of the key. So the keys, think about it like that safety deposit box. you have a key, the system's got a key, and as long as your key works and their key works, you get in. So think about it like the bank's version of the key is in that TPM. Then you've got to use your key, which is your password, your username and password. That's your key. And it authenticates you along with that TPM info. Both those go together into the algorithm. And the algorithm is just this complex calculation that once it does what it's got to do with those two pieces of data coming in, if the result is what it's supposed to be, boom, you got access to whatever data on the hard drive you need. We've got a BitLocker applet, and we showed different applets last week, and we'll get into it. Same thing, going through the system and go into security strategies. All right. So we've got folders, files, and printers. Now, we talked about a bunch of different ways to control access to them. Individual policies, excuse me, group policies, policies associated with your role. We can have policies not just on the system itself, but on the network. We talked last week about actually locking things down, physically locking them, putting cables and whatnot. But in Windows, we use the term privileges, permissions, or rights. It's all the same thing. What are you able to do? And we want to limit the rights, the access, the privileges, the permissions, whatever we want to call it, make it as strict as we can so that the more people have access to, the more they have the ability to do wrong things, to mess things up, if you will. So we can put rules on the printer, and there can be a printer group. And if you're not a member of the printer group, you don't have access to it. And what are the rules about the printer group? Whatever we want them to be. You can only print so many pages a week. You can only print during certain hours. Whatever we want it to be, and we can set those. Same kind of things when it comes to files and folders. Those folders have rights and permissions associated with them. And if I don't want you having access to them, you know what? This folder has permissions, and it may not have anything to do with a group policy. So we can set permissions on the file itself. We can set permissions on the folder itself. We can set permissions on the printer itself. Or I can make those items associated with specific groups. And if you're not a member of that group, and that makes it a little bit easier if we're dealing with multiple items that are being controlled. We'll just set up a group that here's a printer group, and you have access to these printers. Now, we've got 3 different built-in user groups, and we can make as many as we want, but there's only 3 of them that are built in. I guess 4. So we've got admin, and we've got traditional users. Users, by default, I try to set them up with specific permissions. Guests have very limited permissions, and it's a temporary profile that as soon as they're gone, whatever they had access to, they can't come back in. So you come in, do what you got to do, and then you're gone. And this is, think of it like a guest pass. That's all it is. We don't have, well, I said 3. We don't have this power users group anymore. So I say 3 now, but in the past we'd had this power users group, and it's, I don't know, it's not something that we really need to deal with so much. It's more read and write permissions dealing with files and folders. It's antiquated. But if you see it, it's backward compatible with 10 and 11. But it's something that they just don't deal with it anymore. It's a legacy group, or a legacy built-in group. But it's not technically, we have access to it now, but the only reason we have access to it is because of older system. It's not used in the new systems. So I can go in through an applet, create new groups, assign members, create policies associated with those groups. I can create a group that you have to be authenticated by logging in, and you're a member of that group. And then there's another group that everybody's a member of. And then we've got anonymous users. They haven't logged in, but I can set permissions associated with that group and create whatever kind of groups that I want and configure security in whatever way I want, limit access to whatever resources, and it's all dictated by what resources they are, the level of risk associated with those resources being accessed. And like I said, the stricter the rules, the better we are, the safer we are. So we talked about having groups and rights and permissions. We've got work groups. That's technically, we look at it as a small group, and we're not doing this over a network. It may be some shared-to-share, peer-to-peer computers. They're connected, but it's not stuff that's being controlled over a network, a traditional network like we deal with today. On a network computer, we call it domain controlling. We deal with things on Active Directory, so that's where that's being controlled. The older stuff, we'd have those rights and permissions on the system, and when you go to talk to another computer, you're sharing that information with the other computer of the rights, privileges, and permissions. The local user. So let's say I'm connected to one of you folks over a peer-to-peer network. My computer is visible to your computer, but I only let you see what I want you to see, and I only share or provide access to you what I want to provide you access to. So that's this concept of work group sharing. Now, if we were dealing with a networked permissions, the resources are networked resources. And those permissions are dictated on the network, not by me or not by somebody else. Now, when we're talking about networking, you'll see it when you log into computers on campus. You'll have networked permissions, you'll have folders that are, there's your stuff, and then there's the college stuff. When I log into my computer, I've got multiple accounts that I access. When I look in the files, I can see my personal Google Cloud. I see my college Google Cloud. I see a connection to Microsoft. I see a connection to FAU's Google Cloud. Got another university that I've worked for 15, 20 years. Access to that. And all of those drives are network drives. But because I've configured my user account on my device to talk to those servers, it all syncs up. So if somebody wants to make something available to me on a networked level, or I'm a member of a group, automatically through that drive, I can see those resources. My permissions change. I can either see more or have access to more, or see less, have access to less. Now I can create things. I'll have all those, and then I've got my personal stuff, my local stuff. That's on, we always see it say on this computer or on the local computer. And that's stuff that it's technically stored on your C drive. And when you logged in, you've got an account in users on C drive, and it will have your name or whatever account you've set up with. Your permissions and all that will be associated with that as administrator. If you're not administrator, then it limits what you have access to. The administrator has access to files that are hidden that a guest would not have access to. And I've literally got to right click those files or folders to show hidden files or folders. They're not shown by default. So the share permissions, remember we were talking about the peer-to-peer stuff? That's when we're talking about share permissions. NTFS handles share permissions and NTFS permissions. So NTFS, that's that new technology file system. That was the bridge from the old standalone to the network stuff. We're talking about exFAT, FAT32. That's typically, you're talking about something that's standalone device or peer-to-peer device. We're talking about NTFS, then we're dealing with networked permissions. If let's say I got a promotion and I became the dean of the college, one of the deans. As a dean, I would have permissions associated with my role in the organization. They would be I would inherit those because of a role that I had. So somebody has given me these just because of who I am now. Oh, you're the dean, I will give you these permissions. Now, I can also create explicit permissions to where I literally go say, all right, you know what? I'm not just giving you these because of your role. I got something that traditionally you wouldn't get. And I'm going to give you this permission because I know you and I know that you're not going to abuse it. You're not going to do anything wrong with it. And you need it for some project. Then we're talking about explicit permissions. how to share files and folders. Essentially, we just right click on them and we can go in and look at how to share them over a peer-to-peer network. Creating folders and user accounts in groups. We've got an applet that in previous pages, similar interaction with it. We've got the applet and we just create the new group, give it a name. And once it's been created, then we can assign people to it. Now, before you add somebody to a group, create the group, give it a name as you're creating it, and have it planned. You've got to plan this stuff out. You can't just willy-nilly start, oh, I'm going to create a whole bunch of groups. It's all going to be mapped out. Why do you have the group? What's that group going to have access to? What's special about that group? What is that group not going to have access to, and why? It kind of goes to that whole accounting and payroll groups that I was talking about before. So we can go into the applet, go create what kind of group it is. Once I've created the group, then we start looking at what permissions. And when we're talking about permissions, it's, do I want you to have access to something? Now, having access, there's different levels of access. There's read-only access. There's write access. There's a list of them as we go through it. It should come up. There we go. Full control, modify, read and execute. List folder contents, read, write, and there's more down below it. And for each user that I've created or each group, I go in and I can edit the permissions. So if I created a new group, come down, edit the permissions associated with this group. Now, the one that's allowed to do everything, administrators. And as you get down to lower levels, yeah, I don't want you being able to have full control over everything and modifying things, whatever it may be. So we've got them listed out here. What can you do and what can't you do? Just try to keep everything as protected as we can. If you don't need it, I'm not going to give you access to it. That's the best policy to have with it. Okay. One of the things we've got to keep track of is permissions that get inherited. You could be the member of two different groups, and if one group has deny on it, and the other group you're a member, you're not denied, you're allowed, the stronger of the two holds. Keep that in mind. The stronger of the two, you're a member of two separate groups. They both have access to the same folder. Say it's a folder. One of the groups that you're a member of says, yeah, you can do that. You can read and execute. The other says, no, you can't. Whatever's more strict is the one you get stuck with. So it's one of those things, like I said, if it's all mapped out, it doesn't get complicated, but the less we plan, the more complicated these things can get. Always go troubleshoot things, check to see if they work the way that you think they're working, and not just, well, I set it up right, and sure, it's going to work. It's always a trust but verify in anything that we do. Any of the resources that we're dealing with, especially if we're dealing with networked resources, the path, and we've got to go test those paths to see, can we get to what we've got to get to? These same things that we're doing in the GUI interfaces and the applets, you can go do the same thing in command line, but it gets really ugly. You really appreciate having a GUI when you've got to suffer with not having one. Similar, we're looking at the permissions for the individual. What kind of permissions does everyone have? Full control, change, or read? Well, I'll go ahead and give you read. I don't want everyone to have change and full control. So we try to be as restrictive as we can, and I can't emphasize that enough. All right. So there's some things here relative to network, being protected over a network. And network discovery, it's kind of like having your garage door open. And somebody came up and knocked on my door one day and asked me if I wanted to sell the car that I had in my garage. Well, if he couldn't see it, he would have never knocked on my door. But I made it visible. And by making it visible and him driving down the road 45 miles an hour, he just happened to see it. Oh, let me go see. You want to sell that car? That's the concept of network discovery. So if you allow your computer to be discoverable, then people that see your computer can go look to see what's in your computer. What things do you have available? Are you sharing your printer? I got a neighbor that's got his printer shared over Wi-Fi, no password. Every now and then I'll connect to it and print something off. And it's just a reminder, dude, and he doesn't know it's me. It could be anybody. So there's things that we've got to do to connect, protect ourselves over the network. So we've got to be cautious about what's visible, what's being shared, who can read, write, or access files over the network. Okay. All right. One of the things that we've got to be real cautious about is what we allow people to do when it comes to deleting stuff. The fact that they accessed it, well, I get it. You had access to it. At least it's still there. The fact that you've gone and deleted something, all right, now it's making it uglier for me, more difficult, because I'm going to have to go deal with things to fix what you've done. So this section, they focus on the hierarchy of permissions and the hierarchy of folders and subfolders. If you have ownership of a parent folder, you inherit permissions of all of those below, unless there is a setting that says, no, you didn't. Always test to make sure that the permissions are what you think they are. And if you've been given permissions at a high level, go look down at those subfolders and click on those and see what your permissions are. Okay. So just talked about not leaving my garage door open so people can see what's what. I've seen businesses that have blinds up to where you can't see in the business, but they've got this neon light looking sign. I don't think it's a legit neon, but it's got the appearance of it, that says open. So even though you can't see in to see what's going on behind the shades, just in front of the shades, there's this sign that says open. So they're letting you see what they want you to see, and they control that from inside, turn it on and off. And if they turned it off, you may not even be able to see it because it's just so dark in there. Now, I can map a drive on the network and give you access to that drive or to that printer or to that device. Now, it could be a folder that I map. And essentially what it is I give you permissions to it over the network. And I set it up in Active Directory. Permission that you get. And by creating this mapped drive, and I give you permission to that mapped drive, you're actually getting access to it through what I want to call a pointer. You don't have access directly to it. You get access to something that points to it. So it's not like, here, I'm going to give you a key to the room and you can go in that room and do whatever you want in there. It's not like that. It's like, I give you access to that device, but you never access the room. I let you connect to it over the wire, and you can't even see what else is in that room. And you can't access anything else other than that one device or that network share. So I could give you a share to a folder. I could give you a share to a file, a share to a resource. And by doing that, you have this mapped connection. You may see commercials on TV. Selling software that allows you to do conceptually the same thing from home, where you're connecting to the organization, but it's through a mapped connection and it's encrypted and you're the only one who has access to it. Conceptually about the same thing. Nobody else can see it because they don't have rights and permissions to even see the link to get to it. So it's mapped to a server. And the server, think of that as the pointer. And then the pointer to what? This folder or this share called projects. It could be storage over the network, could be printers, could be folders, could be just about whatever I want to connect to over the network. If I'm going over the network, I either need, and they're talking about here, connecting to network printer. If you've got the name of it or it's an IP address, you can connect to it that way, and then you'll likely have to authenticate. So if you know what the device is or where the device is, where being the IP address, what being the name, it could go recognize it, but you're still going to have authentication you're going to have to get through to be able to do what you've got to do. What ends up happening, and here's those numbers that I was talking about, 4 octets that we've got. And we ping the device to see, are you there? And it's almost like, in a way, it's like knocking on a door, seeing if somebody answers. So we've got somebody's phone number. We call them and we send out a request. The request goes out and we don't hear anything. They didn't answer, but we get this dial. It's like it's ringing. Tries it again. That ringing comes back. Tries it again. The ringing comes back. Tries it again. The ringing comes back. Conceptually, when it comes to networking, we send out 32 bytes. How long did it take to get there? And did I get a response back? And what was the time to live on it? So how long did the whole thing take? The last one took 16 milliseconds. But it responded. So that IP address was a valid one, and the two devices are talking to each other. How many packets did we send? We saw the 4 packets. How many were received? Any of them get lost? Approximate round trip. Min, 1 millisecond. The max was 16. The average, divided it by 4. It's 19 divided by 4 and then rounded down. We have to be able to talk to devices. I've got a network printer sitting next to me. That same thing. Connect to it over my network. Nobody outside has access to the printer. It's not a shared Wi-Fi printer. Even though it is on Wi-Fi, it's not a public Wi-Fi printer. So we can configure these network devices, ping it. Yep, it came back. We verified, yep, that printer is there. Let's get the connection going. I talked about things being hidden, and the administrator is the only one that has access to them. We hide as much as we can, because if people can't see it, they're not going to hurt it. They don't have access to it. I don't want to tempt them with things. The registry, don't let them touch that. Boot files, I don't let them touch it, don't let them see it. A lot of things like that I keep locked down. I may have things on my local device I don't want anybody over the network having access to. I hide them. And that's generally as an administrator. So when we're talking about Active Directory, and that's what we've been talking about the whole time for the most part. Active Directory it's managed on a server. It's got a database built into it that keeps track of all these roles and permissions and users and groups. And it's all in there and it's all tied together. And it authenticates accounts and authorizes these accounts, what they can do, but it's not just Active Directory domain services, which is that what I just spoke of. There's different levels of Active Directory. There's certificate services that ensures you are who you say you are. We got federation services that has to do with relationships and trusts between entities. We've got rights management services, and that deals with securing data. And then there's lightweight directory services, and that's handling applications and who's allowed to run certain applications and who's not. I may not want you running certain applications. It's dangerous, don't want you having access to it. So Active Directory is this one-stop shop for all of it. It's not as complicated as it may seem, but like I said, it takes a lot of planning to set these things up right. Now, I set up different forests, and within the forest, I'll have a domain here, and I may have multiple domains over here, different sites connected in that domain, and there's trusts between them. So this could be two different subsidiaries of the same corporation. Here's one subsidiary, here's the other. Yeah, I want access to all of it, and I want them to have a relation trust between the two, but we're going to go ahead and change things up. Or it could be, I'd used that example before about the 3 different regional divisions. Could be 3 different forests, each one for a different region. And the eastern region has a domain and multiple sites on it. The central region has a domain and multiple sites on it. And all of those resources can be, they can have trust relationships back and forth. Oh, these security groups of the security group here are also, there's a trust between them and the security group here and the security group here. Or I may not give them federated access. Excuse me. So we create what's called organizational units. And I say it's easier for technicians to assign privileges to users when it comes to OUs, but you can only be a member of one OU. So you can't be a member of multiple OUs, and that can be problematic sometimes. So we'll set up organizational units. Here's the domain users organizational units. And then down below, here's another OU, and here's another OU. You're not members of both. You're a member of one. And there's policies, permissions associated with that individual OU. We use those group policy objects, and those objects, they have functionality associated with them, have attributes associated with them, and that allows us to inherit policies and permissions across the OU. I deal with this a lot in the server classes, because this is more the server side and not client side, we were talking about operating systems. But with this, we're essentially talking about what's taking place on a networked or server side system without even dealing with the server itself. We have a group policy, controls that OU. We've got different groups within the OU, and then we've got shares down below it. And everything, like I said, there's a lot of planning and a lot of mapping that's taking place. Not so difficult to go create and manage user accounts. So we've got an example of Windows Server, and this is Server Management Console. So this is what we can open up on the desktop. And we come up here, it says Tools. And when I click Tools, then I can come down and I can control whatever it is I want to. See how good the resolution is on this. That's not great. But Active Directory, users and computers, and whatever it is, DNS, this cleanup, whatever I want to control from the server manager dashboard. These are all different tools that I have access to. So I can access this remotely from another device. I don't even have to be sitting at the server itself. I can access it through the admin center. So I can go in, and depending on what I want to do, where do I want to create the user? And that's, remember I said, you can only be a member of one OU. So if I'm going to make you a user in the OU, all right. So they've broken this down and they say there's 6 OUs in here. 6 within the domain. And which one are you going to be a member of? And then we'll make you a member of that OU. And right click, new user, get an applet up, and then I've got to go set up your account with your username, first name, middle initial, last name, what your username is going to be, what the default password will be for you to create your account. Here we go through, and this is what I would traditionally do in Lake Worth at that lab I was talking about. I'll right click on users because I don't want it to be on a specific OU. So right click on users, new user, first name, last name, middle initial if needed. It automatically populates the full name. You have to type in whatever the configuration you want. And here's the domain that you're a member of. So home run, home run. Carlos is what we have so far at. So I would traditionally go Carlos S or Sanchez C. Then I hit next. Then we get to the password part. Here's the default one. You have to change it on your next one. Do not select this. Never expires. I can go in here and say your account's disabled. That fast, you can't get in. Once I've done it, you're now in users, and I can go in and add you to a group. Group do you want me to add you to? And it could be whatever one. Let's go check to see. So we've got financial group. So it came up, pick that. Click OK and go. And I can go in here and I can look on financial to see the name of the users, or I can search for you in that domain. Say, all right, here he is. And I can go click on you. Once I click on you, it brings me back to what we saw before. Same thing that I was going through step by step, but now it's all tabbed out. So I pick whatever tab I want to control aspects of you. Now, these are all Active Directory components. This is all little pieces of that database that I was talking about associated with Active Directory. Little bits of information about you. That fast, I can delete you out. I can go in and I can see, you know what? I don't want them accessing on Sunday. I don't want them accessing on Saturday. I don't want them accessing in the middle of the night. And once I've done that, you cannot log in outside these windows. So I can change those things. There's so many different little things that we can go in and modify. Administrators, I can go create an administrator, and same kind of process, step by step, just filling in the blanks. And now all of a sudden, I've created another administrator. So your part of Active Directory, I said we were dealing with resources, human resources, the users, and the files, the folders, the applications, and all those things. Those are resources. We talked about before, I could create a network share, so it's a folder that I allow individuals to access. By default, we create networked shares for individuals, and everything they do goes back to that networked share, so that when you connect to the network through whatever computer, you're not saving stuff on the local device. You're saving stuff to your networked drive where all your stuff's located. So if that computer you logged in on gets stolen, blows up, whatever it may be, you still got access to your stuff over the network. Talked about multi-factor. Text too big. Mentioned the GPOs, group policy objects. I want to create group policies as much as I can and have them associated with the individual OUs, so that I made you a member of an organizational unit. Now you've got group policies that you have associated with. I can go in and manage those group policies associated with the OUs. So it makes it easier to set up permissions and access and everything for an individual within an OU. I can create scripts that control different aspects of what's going on. To run when you log on, when you log off. Things that take place when you do that. If I've changed, let's say I've changed a policy. That policy doesn't take effect traditionally until I roll it out. And I can say, you know what, I'll roll it out and that policy will take effect on your next login. Or when you log out. either way. And I can force the update to take place. Now, it doesn't mean I'm kicking you out and all of a sudden it takes place. But I can set it to where you have to log out at the end of the day, and it goes into effect some point at the end of the day, or when you log back in tomorrow. So there's a number of ways that we can enforce these GPO changes that have taken place. A lot of this, they really added in from the last version to this one, dealing more with server side than they had in the past. This stuff is so important because everything that we deal with today is networked, all of it. You don't do, yeah, it seems like you're doing it on your home computer. Your home computer is just a way for you to access resources online. You can store versions of stuff on your home computer, but if that home computer fails, so sorry, because it can be difficult to recover whatever it may be. So as much as we don't like storing our stuff in the cloud, if we can find reliable, safe cloud storage, it's huge. Going to reporting.